So today we're going to start talking about the different groups of vertebrates and how they've become more and more advanced over time. So we already talked about, if we look at this cladogram, we've already talked about the lanceolate and the tunicates. So they were chordates, meaning they had those four characteristics at some point in their life: the dorsal nerve cord, the notochord, the pharyngeal gill pouches, and the postanal tail. In tunicates, that was only found in the embryo. In lanceolates, they maintain those characteristics their whole life. But what doesn't happen in them is they don't actually get a vertebral column, a backbone. And so the subphylum vertebrate are all the organisms under this phylum Chordata that actually do develop a backbone. And so we're going to start today with talking about the different groups of fish, all these different groups of fish, and sort of the advancements that occurred from the simplest of these fish, the jawless fish, to the lobe-finned fish, which then is going to lead us to amphibians and some of our other groups. All right, so let's start with our jawless fish. So these guys belong to a class called, it's not in your notes, but it's called Agnatha, and this is your jawless fish. It includes hagfish and lampreys, and just like it sounds like, they do not actually have jaws. They have more like a sucker-like mouth. They do have a notochord. They do have rudimentary, meaning primitive vertebrae, but they don't have jaws. And so the hagfish are scavengers. They produce a bunch of slime. They're really slimy. If you try to pick them up, they slip out of your hands. And then lampreys, a lot of them are parasites, and they can be long. They can be like a foot long, and they have this sucker that's just lined with these rows of teeth. And so I'll show you a picture of them. So this is a lamprey in the top left, and you see how it does not have jaws. It just has sort of a hole for a mouth. But this one just sort of eats dead stuff. This one, the lamprey, look at that. It's got those teeth that line the jaw. Now, they don't attack people, but I know that they can be a real pest for people when they're raising fish and things like that, that the lampreys do become parasitic of the fish, and they can create these big scars on the sides of the fish where they attach to them. So after these primitive ones, the next thing that we see is that jaws developed. And about 440 million years ago, you're not going to be tested on the times, but we start seeing more well-developed fins, and we see jaws, and then the gill slits, some of those gill slits stay and actually become gills, which then become a source of gas exchange. So this just shows one of the suggestions of how the jaws developed over time. We're not really going to get into the details of that. And so there's three different groups of jawed fish, fish with jaws. The first one is Chondrichthyans or Chondrichthes. So chondro actually means cartilage. And ichthy, I-C-H-T-H-Y-E, ichthy means fish. So Chondrichthes really is cartilage fish. They have a skeleton, but it's made of cartilage, not a bony calcium-type skeleton. What we have, it's not as strong. I know that on land, they'll collapse under their own weight, like sharks. They can't stay out of the water. They also don't have as well-developed of gills. I know that for a lot of them, they have to continually swim in order to breathe. So they have to sort of force the water over their gills. Ray-finned fish, they actually belong to a group sometimes called osteichthyes. So the ichthy, remember, means fish. Oste refers to bone, like osteo. So these are actually bony fish. And these ray-finned fish would be like the ones you eat, the ones you might have as a pet. I think of their fins in a ray-finned fish, as looking like little sun rays. They're like little sticks connected to each other. So this is like your ray-finned fish. And then the lobe-finned fish, which includes the coelacanth, which is sometimes called like a living fossil because they thought they were extinct, and lungfish, these are actually more advanced. We think these are the ones that led to the first organisms living on land. They actually have pectoral fins on the side that actually have a thick bone inside. And they also, some of them actually have like a lung sac where they can come up and gulp oxygen. So this is an advancement over the ray-finned fish and the Chondrichthyans. So sharks and rays have a cartilage skeleton, The ray-finned fish do have a bony skeleton, but then the lobe-finned fish actually have a more advanced skeleton as far as moving towards land, living on land. So this is a shark. I think everybody knows what a shark and stingray are, so they do have a cartilage skeleton. This is just a picture of your typical ray-finned fish. Feathery gills, they usually have this thing called an operculum that covers it, and they can open and close that to sort of, they can actually stay stationary, unlike a shark that's typically swimming all the time. They can just sort of flap this, open and close it, and sort of force water to flow through across the gills so they can get the oxygen out of it. Another thing these guys tend to have is something called a swim bladder. The swim bladder fills with oxygen, or air, I should just say, and what it does is it lets them rise and fall in the water. So if you have fish in a fish tank, a lot of times you'll just see them sitting in place and they'll just sort of sink down or go up. They do that with their swim bladder and their operculum that sort of flaps and moves their gills, whereas the Chondrichthyans, the sharks and the stingrays, are typically swimming and moving all the time, and they don't have swim bladders, so they can't rise and fall in the water. They have to expend more energy to rise and fall in the water. This is just showing all the different fins. You're not going to be tested on the types of fins in a fish. It's something more you'd learn in marine bio. But pelvic, this is the pectoral fins. Dorsal fin, most people know the dorsal fin because of sharks. This is called the caudal fin, usually used for steering. This is the anal fin. So these are the general fins of a fish. And then this on the bottom, this is a picture of a lobe-finned fish. So they're really kind of weird looking, but notice how they have a much thicker bone structure in here and here than the ray-finned fish. Ray-finned fish tend to have little skinny bones in their fins. They don't have this thick bone. And a lot of these, like I said, also have air sacs, so they can come up and gulp oxygen. That's just a little video of seahorses. And so that brings us to tetrapods. So tetra means four, and if you remember, pod means foot. So we're looking at the first organisms that actually had limbs and feet. So the development of four appendages, like legs, or even in a bird where two are wings and two are legs. We're talking about four appendages. So we believe that this came from one of the lines of lobe-finned fish, and this allowed them to move to land, and once they could colonize land, they could go in all kinds of places, and if you remember, we're talking about adaptive radiation, that they could then, they evolve into all these different groups of amphibians, mammals, reptiles, birds, and their descendants. Because land, now they could colonize the land, there wouldn't have been any predators there, because they would have been the first things there, so there would have been lots of food, lots of space, lots of everything, and they could move out, and then over time diverge into all these different species. And so this is just showing the lungfish and some of the lobe-finned fish, and that one of these groups, we believe, started to get digits, meaning fingers, and then this led to the amphibians, and then the reptiles, birds, and the mammals. Okay, so quickly, let's talk about amphibians. So amphibians include salamanders, frogs, and those are caecilians. Technically, if you just remember frogs and toads, that would be fine for a really good example of amphibians. Now, here's the thing. They do breathe with lungs. They do have lungs, but their lungs are not extremely efficient. So they supplement their breathing by having moist skin. In other words, you can't actually take oxygen into your blood as a gas. You don't have bubbles of oxygen floating in your blood. What has to happen is the oxygen has to dissolve. So they have big sac-like lungs, and you'll see this when you dissect the frog. Our lungs aren't like that. They're not just like a big empty sac with a membrane around it. We have little tiny what are called alveoli, little miniature air sacs, and every one of those air sacs is covered with something called surfactant, and it allows oxygen to dissolve into the capillaries, into the bloodstream. Well, since amphibians don't have these little tiny air sacs, they just have two giant sacs for lungs, then air can only diffuse through that moist surface into the bloodstream around the edges, not all this within. And it's not enough, really, to get enough oxygen to give them their energy and everything else. So, by having a moist skin, they can dissolve oxygen through their skin, and they can breathe that way too. Some of them do have poison glands. Now, they also have to return to water to lay eggs. Frog eggs will typically dry out on land. So, even though we see that amphibians are kind of a step up from fish, they've got legs, they can jump, they can move on land, they have strong skeletons for land, but They don't have extremely well-developed lungs, so they have to keep a moist skin and stay near the water for that purpose. And they have to lay their eggs in the water, so they still have to go reproduce. And amphibian actually translates loosely to double life. Well, that's because as babies, interestingly, like fish, they breathe with gills. Their larval stage in a frog, you're, I'm sure, well aware, is the tadpole. Well, tadpoles breathe with gills, so they're more like a fish. And then they go through a metamorphosis, they lose their tail, they develop their lungs, and then they can actually come onto land. Another thing about amphibians is they only have a 3-chambered heart. So fish only had a 2-chambered heart, by the way. So it's a simple pump. There's a top chamber called the atrium. There's a bottom chamber called the ventricle. And basically the blood comes into the atrium, into the ventricle, it gets a big pump, and then it goes all the way around the body. Well, in frogs and amphibians, what we see is a 3-chambered heart. And so it's sort of a double pump. It gets pumped, it goes into one atrium, this is low oxygen blood, and then this is higher oxygen blood coming from the lungs, and then it leaves out the bottom, and the both of them mix together. So what gets mixed in the bottom chamber is a mix of blood with oxygen and blood without oxygen. So it's still a double pump, because when this goes out, it splits, and some goes to the lungs, and some goes to the body. So it's a benefit over the fish, where it's one heart pump has to get the blood all the way around, whereas here the blood's not traveling as long of a distance. It leaves that ventricle and goes in 2 directions, to the lungs and back, to the body and back. But because the blood mixes in that bottom chamber, one ventricle, then you end up with what's going to the body as sort of a mix of high oxygen and low oxygen blood. All right. So here are some examples. Caecilians, which look kind of like an earthworm or a snake, but it is more advanced than an earthworm and less advanced than a snake. Salamanders, also newts, frogs, and toads. How are they adapted? How come they're not completely adapted for terrestrial or land life? Well, remember, like I said, they lay their eggs in water, so they have to return to the water for that purpose. Their lungs are not extremely well developed, so they also keep a moist skin and they breathe through their skin. So they are somewhat adapted to life on land, but not as well adapted as our next group, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and that's going to be the reptiles. And reptiles are going to have a major adaptation, a special kind of egg and a special kind of skin that's going to allow them to actually not have to necessarily return to the water ever. They only need very small amounts of water, in fact. And so this is going to make them more advanced.